before the first footstep ever pressed into the soil that would one day be called America, before the first canoe slid across a river, before the first campfire lit the darkness of the ancient forests, the story of the American people had already begun. Not in this land, not upon any sea, not in any earthly kingdom, but in the very breath of God. In the beginning, when there was no nation, no border, no tribe, no language, there was only creation, unspoiled and unmarred. The Bible opens not with political lines or histories of migration, but with the voice of God speaking order into chaos, light into darkness, land into the waters, and finally, humanity into existence. Adam and Eve walked in a world where no separation existed, no race, no ethnicity, no culture, no division. They were simply human beings, fashioned in the image of the divine. From these two came every people who would ever walk the earth, every kingdom that would rise and fall, every empire that would build monuments to its own glory, every tribe that would find its home in forests, deserts, islands, and mountains, every family that would cross oceans and carve new lives from wilderness. Their story was the seed from which the story of all humanity would grow, including the diverse, complex, and deeply intertwined story of the American people. Humanity multiplied. Sons and daughters spread across the early world. Civilization stirred. But as the generations grew, so did the corruption that beat within human hearts. The world became violent, broken, and cruel. Scripture describes a moment when wickedness became so widespread that God decided to start again, not by destroying humanity, but by preserving it through one family. Noah. Noah's story is not just the tale of a survivor. It is the story of the entire human race being reset. When the floodwaters rose and covered mountains, when great cities disappeared beneath the waves, when all the works of early civilizations vanished into silence, only 8 survivors remained. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives stepped into a world washed clean. From these 8, God repopulated the earth. This is the foundation of biblical anthropology. Every nation alive today, every people group across every continent, ultimately traces its existence back to this single reboot of human lineage. Which means the origin of the American people begins not in 1492, not in the Bering Strait migration, not in colonial settlements, but in the post-flood world, standing fresh and empty beneath a new sky. The Bible carefully traces the families of Noah's sons. From Shem came the Semitic peoples, ancestors of Israel, Arabia, Mesopotamia. From Ham came civilizations of Africa and early Canaan. From Japheth came tribes that migrated north and west, entering the lands that would later become the cradle of Europe. Through these ancient genealogies, Scripture lays the early architecture of global populations. Japheth's descendants, scattered across the coastlands and distant regions, would centuries later produce the people who sailed across oceans and eventually reached the shores of the New World. But their journey was never simple or direct. The world had one more great turning point, a moment when humanity attempted to unite not under God, but against him. The Tower of Babel. At Babel, the world spoke one language. People gathered in the plain of Shinar with a bold defiance. Let us build a tower to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. It was humanity's declaration of self-sufficiency, a refusal to acknowledge the Creator. So God intervened, not with floodwaters this time, but with language. In an instant, their voices split. Words became foreign. Commands became confusion. A family became strangers. This divine scattering is one of the most important moments in the biblical explanation of human diversity. It is the reason tribes separated. It is the reason cultures developed distinct identities. It is the reason people migrated into distant, unknown lands. And through this scattering, the long, slow formation of global populations began. Some moved east toward Asia. Some moved south into Africa. Others traveled west and north through Europe. And some, far earlier than written history, migrated across ancient land bridges before rising seas cut off continents for one another. These early peoples became the ancestors of indigenous tribes who would eventually inhabit the Americas long before European contact. These migrations, though not detailed in Scripture, fit the biblical framework that from one man, one flood, and one scattering, God formed all the nations of the world. The Bible teaches that God himself sets the boundaries of nations and orchestrates the movement of peoples, which means the formation of the American people, indigenous, European, African, Asian, does not sit outside the biblical story. It is woven directly into it. Centuries rolled forward. Kingdoms flourished and withered. Egypt rose in splendor. Babylon conquered with brilliance and brutality. Persia ruled with precision. Greece shaped philosophy. Rome shaped law, authority, and empire. Through every rise and fall, the descendants of Noah's sons moved across continents, carrying both the image of God and the brokenness of human rebellion. And then, in the fullness of time, Jesus Christ entered the world. His coming was not regional. It was not tribal. It was not limited to Israel's soil. His message, that salvation was for all nations, echoed the reality that humanity shared one origin and one creator. His command to his disciples to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth spoke not only of spiritual mission, but also of the destiny of nations. The scattered would be gathered again, not by geography, but by faith. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and beyond, Europe became a continent steeped in biblical influence. Its kingdoms rose and fell, but its identity was shaped by Scripture. The tribes of Japheth, once wandering and fractured, became nations that carried the Bible in their culture, language, art, and governance. These were the peoples who, many centuries later, would traverse the Atlantic Ocean. But long before that crossing, the Americas were already thriving with civilizations of their own, deeply rooted cultures with centuries of history, innovation, spiritual traditions, and complex social systems. According to the biblical worldview, these early Americans were descendants of the same Noahic family, scattered early in human history through migrations that crossed into the continent long before the Bible's written timeline focuses on the Middle East. They were not outsiders to the biblical story. They were part of the same human race, shaped by the same divine origin, carrying the same image of God. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas was not the beginning of American humanity. It was the beginning of a collision of worlds, a collision heavy with tragedy, misunderstanding, disease, conquest, and spiritual conflict. The biblical narrative never hides the dark side of human nature. When power encounters vulnerability, Scripture warns that sin often takes the throne. And yet, even in tragedy, the story of nations keeps unfolding. Europeans came for many reasons. Some came for wealth. Some came for land. Some came for power. But others came fleeing religious persecution, forced from their homes for their beliefs. These refugees crossed the ocean with the hope of building a land where they could worship freely. In their minds, they were reenacting the journeys of Abraham, Moses, and Israel, leaving old worlds for new promises. They carried with them not only European culture, but biblical expectation. They believed God was guiding them into a new land for a divine purpose. Yet the Bible also warns that people often mistake their own ambition for God's will. The settlement of the Americas became a mixture of sincere faith, cultural blindness, courage, greed, sacrifice, conflict, and survival. Out of this crucible emerged the earliest layers of what would one day become the American identity. Into this complexity came another chapter, the forced arrival of African peoples through the brutality of the slave trade. Millions were taken from their homelands, ripped from families, transported across oceans in a suffering unimaginable. This chapter is not an interruption to the biblical story. It is a painful reflection of humanity's sin repeating itself through history. The Bible contains its own records of oppression, bondage, and cries for deliverance. And the enslaved brought to America carried their own spiritual strength, resilience, and faith that would deeply shape the nation's future. By the time America began forming into colonies and later a nation, it had already become one of the most ethnically and culturally complex societies in human history. Indigenous tribes rooted for millennia, Europeans from many nations, Africans from diverse regions, and later Asians and Middle Easterners, all contributing to a unique emerging identity. From a biblical perspective, this convergence was not random. It reflected a mysterious, global gathering of the scattered, a nation formed not from one tribe or one lineage, but from many. As America grew, its foundational documents echoed biblical themes: liberty, equality under God, justice, moral order, human value. Even in contradiction and failure, even when America did not live up to its ideals, the language of Scripture shaped its imagination. Nations in the Bible rise quickly and fall heavily. Blessings follow righteousness. Judgment follows pride. The American story fits the same pattern. Triumph and tragedy intertwined, greatness and brokenness mingled, hope and warning walking side by side. The origins of the American people, therefore, cannot be understood merely by geography or discovery. Their roots stretch back through the flood, through the scattering, through ancient migrations, through kingdoms and empires long vanished. They carry the blood of many continents, the imprint of many histories, the wounds of many struggles, the dreams of many souls. They are not one people. They are many peoples forming one nation. From Adam and Eve, from Noah's family, from Babel's scattering, from ancient wanderers, from tribal migrations, from European voyages, from African endurance, from indigenous legacy, from divine orchestration. This is where their story truly begins.